JC.
Welcome, everyone, to today's panel on corporate tax competitiveness. My name is Theo Argitis. I am your moderator for today's discussion, as well as the publisher of Means and Ways, a platform that aims to foster debate through events just like this on key issues where business and economics intersect with politics. You can learn more about us at meansandways.ca, where you can also sign up to our newsletter. Canada's status as a competitive destination for business investment has become a major area of concern, to say the least. Business spending has stagnated and capital flight has reached record levels in recent years, and this may be manifesting in sluggish productivity and sluggish income per capita growth. This is a multifaceted problem. Competitiveness is a multifaceted problem, from regulation to infrastructure and well beyond. What we'll look closely at today is the role of Canada's corporate tax policies. Are we overtaxing our businesses? Are we taxing them in the wrong way? Should we be doing more to incentivize business investment, or is it a problem at all? We've seen recent examples of the federal government tapping into business for more revenue. The capital gains taxes and the global minimum tax and the digital services tax that were just recently enacted. We've had the surtax on financial businesses from a couple of years ago. We have the carbon tax. We're phasing out accelerated depreciation. And we know that emerging fiscal challenges will only make it harder to keep taxes low. The question to the panel is, how can Canada maintain a tax policy that generates investment and job creation while demands on the fiscal purse continue to grow? With us today to talk about this are some of the leading voices in their fields. And thank you for all being here. We have the Honorable Lisa Raitt, Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking at CIBC and the Co-Chair of the Coalition for a Better Future. Lisa brings a wealth of experience addressing corporate competitiveness from her current roles and during her time in government. We have Jon Lieber, Head of Research and Managing Director, US at Eurasia Group. Jon will provide a global perspective on tax trends. We have Nik Nanos, Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research. Nik's recent polling insights will shed light on how the public thinks about these issues. And we have Jack Mintz from the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Jack is one of the country's preeminent tax experts and economists. So thank you all for being here. Jack, let's start with you. You are the tax expert. You've written extensively about tax policy and its implications for competitiveness. How do you assess Canada's current tax position compared to our major trading partners?
Well, let me first start with, I think, a little bit of a quick review of what we've accomplished since the year 2000 and what we have lost since the year 2000. Back in 2000, we actually had one of the worst corporate tax systems in the world in terms of having a very high effective tax rate on capital investment. In fact, the highest in the OECD at that time. And we did carry out a lot of actions between 2000 and 2012 under both Liberal and Conservative governments that led to base broadening, more neutral treatment of different industries, and lower corporate income tax rates, as well as the elimination of capital taxes, except for the financial sector. And we also introduced at the provincial level, the HST, that removed a lot of sales taxes on capital purchases. And by 2012, we actually created a significant policy advantage when it came to our corporate tax system. And I think that's very important, especially living beside the United States, which is a much bigger market, a warmer climate, that if you can kind of tilt the playing field to Canada through policy, I think that's a very important aspect of our competitiveness. And I think that is what has been lost since 2012. We have not raised our corporate income tax rate, except we have introduced a higher corporate income tax rate for finance and insurance companies. That's something that kind of goes against the idea of neutrality. We have done a number of actions outside of accelerated depreciation introduced in 2018, which is now being phased out, as you noticed. But we have taken a number of other actions that have been actually reducing incentives for businesses, except for specific areas like manufacturing and clean energy. I don't think this has been a very smart way of moving ahead. It's not based on good principles of taxation. And what's more important is that we no longer have that competitive advantage relative to our major trading partner. Our corporate income tax rate is now, once including both federal and provincial rates, slightly above the U.S. after its dramatic reform implemented in January 1st of 2018. We've also lost our competitiveness vis-a-vis other provisions in the tax system relative to many other countries as well. In fact, we're about a little higher than the OECD weighted average. And so when you start looking at the combined changes, we've lost our policy advantage. And that, of course, means that we have to have other advantages to attract investment, which we currently don't have with the kind of regulatory system we have, et cetera.
Yeah. So, which is actually the question I want to go to Lisa with. As Jack mentioned, we've lost that advantage on the tax side. How important is it, given the kind of the broader competitive landscape? Are we struggling? Do we need that advantage on tax because we have issues elsewhere in the competitive landscape? Can you kind of tell us how the tax policies intersect with the broader competitiveness landscape? Lisa, I think you might be on mute, actually.
Oh, okay. I'm back. And I just very quickly would say thank you for inviting me. And Jack, that was an excellent layout of our situation, the way it was and the way it is now. I took notes and I'm going to use it. I hope you don't mind. So Theo, to your point with respect to what impact does corporate taxation have in terms of the future, I think it's very apt that you've titled this tipping point, because the work that we do with the Coalition for a Better Future is actually measuring to see how we're doing as a country. And we've been measuring 21 KPIs for the past number of years. We're going into our fourth year now. And year on year, what we are seeing is an alarming deterioration in some of the metrics that really will show and point Canada to what Jack ended with, which is what are the other things that are going to make Canada more competitive and more attractive for investment and indeed have more economic growth. One of the KPIs that we have seen go down is something GDP per capita. That's an important measure because that's going to measure how rich you feel between Canada and the United States, between Canada and Australia. And we're actually declining there. But put simply, and I guess, and I'm happy to elaborate on it at another point, but what we're spending today is the taxes that are coming in. So the balancing is spending today versus the investment that's going to be needed for future economic growth. And that's not all going to come from a government investing tax dollars. That has to come from corporate Canada. The higher your taxes are, the less incentives there are for investment. You're going to see investment in innovation drop. You're going to see investment in human resources drop. You're going to see economic growth actually contract. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in the country right now, according to the measurements that we do in KPI. So I think it is an alarming time. We can talk about productivity and all of the very niche things that flow from it and trying to solve the problem. But one of the biggest things we should be looking at ourselves is, are we competitive on a tax policy basis, which is a pretty fundamental and simple way of ensuring that Canada remains attractive for investment and that Canadian companies have the ability to invest in their future and grow the economic pie, as it were.
Nik, you've done some polling data for us on this issue ahead of this panel and got some interesting results into Canadian views on corporate tax rates. Could you share with us some key takeaways from that poll?
Sure. I'm very happy to report, Theo, that average Canadians support both Jack and Lisa and what they've just said. How about that? I don't know if I should stop. I don't know if I should stop right there, but the thing is that average Canadians get it. In the national survey that we did for Means and Ways, we tested on perceptions related to tax competitiveness, business tax rates in Canada and the United States, because the reality is that the U.S. is really the main and most familiar comparator for most Canadians, because they know that our economies are integrated, and that and they also have a greater sense of what's going on in the United States. And in this survey for Means and Ways, what was clear is that Canadians were much more likely to believe that the business tax rate should be about the same compared to higher in Canada than the United States. The kicker, Theo, is that when we ask Canadians what the impact would be of higher business taxes in Canada compared to the United States, between about 7 out of every 10 score the following as having a negative or somewhat negative impact: that higher business tax rates in Canada compared to the United States would have a materially negative impact on keeping jobs in Canada. It would have a materially negative impact on attracting new investments from outside of Canada, keeping businesses headquartered in our nation, and also Canadians overwhelmingly believe that higher business tax rates in Canada would have a negative or somewhat negative impact on basically our overall global competitiveness.
Jon, from your vantage point at Eurasia Group, you're well versed in global tax trends and how they influence national policies. How do you see the current global tax environment evolving globally, and what are the implications for Canada's ability to remain competitive?
Yeah, thank you, Theo. So I think two big trends that I want to point out over the last decade or so. One is the kind of unified efforts that's been happening, coordinated by the OECD, in order to cut down on untaxed income. And this is a response by governments coordinated because of a concern about tax shelters and the ability for companies to earn income that was never taxed anywhere by any government. And also the rise of increasing the digitization of the economy, which was leading to a phenomenon where you had companies, large digital companies, primarily based in the US, that were selling a lot and generating a lot of economic activity in countries where they didn't have a large physical presence. And because of that, the digital companies were increasingly able to choose what jurisdiction they were subject to tax. So there's been a trend of concern among countries organized under the OECD to try to cut down on this practice in order that they can increase their revenues. And at the same time, in 2017, the United States, for the first time in decades, did tax reform. And what happened then was the US cut its headline corporate income tax rate 35% to 21%, which significantly affected the behavior of US companies who previously had been fairly aggressive in searching out ways that different places that they could house their profits in order to avoid the US corporate tax. So as a result of these two trends, the US reduction in the overall tax rate and the adoption by now dozens of countries of the OECD recommendations, which are for a 15% minimum tax, you've seen big shifts in how companies are shifting their profits around for tax planning reasons. And this has had a big effect in the US, where the use of tax shelters has actually been reduced. And it makes it harder for countries like Ireland, which was famously a low tax jurisdiction, to compete and attract investment from other countries. And this, of course, would have an effect on Canada as well.
And yet the U.S. is not even it hasn't implemented the global minimum tax yet, and appears to be benefiting from it.
Right. Well, the U.S. is not only. I mean, the U.S. did implement a form of a global minimum tax in what's called the GILTI tax, which is designed to be a tax, a kind of additional tax on U.S. companies that keep profits overseas that should otherwise be repatriated. But that tax is not considered compliant with the so-called Pillar 2 of the OECD platform. And so because of that, the U.S. has endorsed the OECD, the Biden administration, I should say, has endorsed the OECD plans with significant pushback from both the U.S. Business community and also Republicans in Congress. The OECD plan had two elements to it. Pillar 1, which was designed to get at sort of difficult to tax profits that maybe weren't housed inside jurisdictions, and then Pillar 2, which was this minimum tax that would get at profits for domestically headquartered companies that were earning money overseas. Lots of countries have implemented Pillar 2, and no countries yet implemented Pillar 1 because it will require global cooperation to make that happen. And the U.S., which is the home of many of the world's most globally productive and profitable companies, is probably never going to implement Pillar 1, would be my guess. And as a result of that, that's really slowed down the adoption of Pillar 1 globally.
And I want to get to the fiscal pressure side of things, and we know that Canada is facing some fiscal pressure and pressure to raise revenue. Are we still with you, Jon? Are other countries also facing similar fiscal pressures? Is the trend not necessarily even with just corporate taxation? Is there a trend towards higher taxation generally globally?
There's definitely a trend towards deteriorating fiscal situation across the developed world. And you're seeing countries like Germany and France dealing with this and looking for, as their social support programs grow larger and larger. The US is a very similar problem. And what you're seeing is companies looking around for new sources of revenue. And that's been one of the drivers behind the OECD program, which was countries like Ireland, which have been historically considered to have a very friendly tax regime that could be used as a way of sheltering profits from taxation, were, in the eyes of France, that was facing growing fiscal pressures. Countries like Ireland were getting the tax revenue they felt they were entitled to. And so that's been one of the impetuses for the OECD program, which is designed to kind of expand the tax reach of some of these countries that are struggling and make it less attractive for companies to park profits in countries like Ireland. And Pillar 2, the adoption of these global minimum standards, has really fixed a lot of that problem and has made it much more difficult for countries like Ireland to become destinations for global capital.
Jack, I want to stick to the theme of fiscal pressure and focus on Canada here. Can you talk a little bit about the fiscal pressures that Canadian governments are facing, and whether you believe it's a significant risk that will drive corporate taxes even higher from here?
Well, I think first of all we should define what we mean by fiscal pressure. As we know, the federal government is running a rather significant deficit still at 40%, $40 billion, although that's likely to grow given the way that budgeting has tried to postpone expenditures and, of course, hurry up some revenues to come in this year to keep the number at 40 billion. However, we also have to remember that's not a big share of GDP. However, our gross debt now, which is the total of all governments, because provinces run rather big amounts or large amounts of debt, is now over 100% of GDP, and that's actually pretty high. The federal government and provinces often like to report the net debt. There's a real problem with net debt numbers. I actually don't like them very much in Canada, and that's because the CPP and the Quebec Pension Plan net assets are included as part of financial assets, but ignores the future liabilities associated with both pension plans, except for 1 year. And those numbers are very big now. They're almost 30% of GDP. And so we really underestimate our net debt position, which is actually much higher than the supposed 50% we have now, or 45%. It's much more closer now to where we were actually back in 1993, which is close to 70%, 75% in terms of net debt, if you actually include all the future liabilities of those two pension plans. So I do think that we do have an issue of fiscal pressures. And of course, there's a lot of expenditures that are needed. I mean, we're spending a huge amount of money on subsidies for green subsidies. We're also spending money on manufacturing subsidies. We have a healthcare system that is badly underfunded, and I think we need to. We're going to have to address some of those issues in the future. And so there are a number of pressures that are there on national defense. I should mention as well as another pressure point, because we're not living up to the commitments of other countries in NATO. And so when you start adding it all up, there's going to be a lot of pressures to spend money. And so there could be a desire to raise taxes as well. And so I think those pressures are there. Would it be higher corporate taxes? I'm not sure. I mean, it may be that it could be other taxes that could be relied upon that have less impact, because I think people at the same time know you have to grow the economy and create revenues in order to fund the kind of expenditures that we also want. And corporate taxes are one of the items that could have very negative impact.
Since I'm staying with you, Jack, on this. Since the pandemic, we've seen corporate income taxes as a share of GDP surpass 3% or at near 3%, which is really, if you look at the fiscal reference tables that are published by the Finance Department, it's as high as it's been since at least mid-1960s. Is there some type of natural limit to how much government, or the federal government in this case, can raise from corporations? Is there some type of curve where after a certain point you're actually seeing a reduction in revenue?
Well, I mean, the reason some of those revenues have gone up is simply because profits as a share of GDP have gone up, but also governments have widened the tax base to some degree. At least compared back to the 1970s, when there was a lot of special preferences introduced into the system. And so we've done a lot of base broadening actually after 2000, and I think we've actually helped bring in more revenues to that extent. I think the real measure you have to do is to look at actually the effective tax rate on profits or on capital, which I do in my own work. And the question is how high you want to go. Well, economists have big arguments about that. There's a group of economists, not myself, but who might argue that there should be no tax on capital. That actually, at least at the margin, for marginal investments, because that's neutral and you'll get the biggest amount of capital investment possible. There are others that will argue that there should be a higher one. So I think it comes really down to some philosophy about what we mean by the best kind of tax system that one wants to have. And there is an argument that, consumption taxes, for example, are better than income taxes. And so therefore we should be shifting our tax base to other taxes away from taxes that affect investment and saving.
Lisa, from a corporate perspective, how do businesses balance the need for competitiveness with being good corporate citizens? Is there a risk that focusing too much on tax competitiveness could lead to a backlash? How do corporations balance these two things?
That's a great question, because the two of them may not exactly correlate with one another. I mean, companies are going to focus on tax competitiveness because they're in competition for capital. As you know, I work for CIBC, and one of the things that's important for financial institutions in the country is to be able to attract foreign investment. If you're not competitive in a tax basis, then it's going to be really tough to attract foreign investment. It's going to be tough to create more capital. And that capital is what's needed in order to lend out to the Canadian population. Also, the kinds of things that you're able to invest in if you're a big corporation, like in technology, for example. I mean, billions of dollars are spent by Canadian financial institutions in technology and in innovation in order to be able to grow and advance. That is not going to be as available to them if they're seeing a situation where there's more more taxation. I would say something to what Jack said too. The government has a couple of roles in all of this, and they're incredibly important. And it really does start with the government. I mean, first and foremost, it's the government that's going to decide how much is being spent. They're the ones that come up with the programming. They're the ones that try to understand what Canadian citizens want to have and implement that into some kind of policy. But they also have the luxury of setting the tax rates that allow them to bring in the revenue to be able to pay for what they're spending. But at the same time, you have to be thinking about the long term in all of these. What are the unintended consequences that come from increasing corporate taxation? And maybe there are intended consequences too at the same time. But the governments have to think about not just in the today and in the now and what they're doing to balance their own budget. What they have to think about is, well, what is that going to do in the long term, 10 years out, 15 years out? And I wonder whether or not that kind of analysis is happening and trying desperately to focus on the fiscal pressures that you refer to, which I just call government spending, when they're responding to pressures that they have to spend more money in other areas. Are they then saying, well, look, for the benefit of the Canadian economy writ large going into the future, we have to make sure that corporate Canada or corporations are able to grow and compete and provide the jobs that we need for the future. So part of the work that we do at the Coalition for a Better Future is try to bring that point up. The fact that it is the long term that's just as important as to what's happening today. And corporate Canada is needed in order to move the innovation side, the R&D side, the employment of people, not to mention the dividends that you receive when you actually have investments like holding bank stocks. Those are paid out to pensioners, to seniors, to all kinds of folks across the country. So, taxation has a very real impact on the today in terms of what banks can do today for people, but it also has an impact on the future in terms of where we stand competitively with other countries in the world and investment.
Lisa, just to follow up on that. I mean, is there a way for business to better communicate their role in the economy to gain public support for more competitive tax rates?
I think they're trying. I mean, you've got lots of organizations out there that want to get the word out. Unfortunately, what happens in Canada is it's almost like we have to have that kind of quelling impact, meaning that what happened with Paul Martin and Mr. Chrétien in the 90s, when there was an outside force that came to Canada and said, hey, listen, we're really beginning to worry about your fiscal house. You have to take some drastic moves to put it back into shape so that we look upon you favorably. Do we really want that to happen here in Canada? Do we have to have a third party from the outside come in and say, look, you're not really doing well, you're going to lose this, or you're not going to be able to do that going into the future? The government, I think, as well, when they're thinking about taxation, they only think about it, in my opinion, they're only thinking about it in terms of revenue generation. I don't know whether or not they think clearly about the unintended consequences that it could have. And I know we're talking about the global minimum tax, but the implementation of that global minimum tax has had a very real and significant impact on Canadian insurance companies, which quite frankly are really superstars on the world stage in terms of the business that they do around the world. And to give you an example, what can governments do? It's not intended by the legislation, and the government should fix it, but it just takes a while to get anything done in government. Been there for 12 years, I can tell you, it's not an easy thing to do. So thinking about taxation, not only in terms of revenue or what tax treaties that we want to make sure we're part of as part of the OECD, those are important things, but thinking it through methodically and understanding what the impacts are and ensuring that Canadian companies are protected, I think that's just as an important part of the policy discussion.
Nik, you are, always in the field polling Canadians. I mean, given the current climate of skepticism, if you want to call it that, towards large corporations, how can companies establish more of a trust and kind of help them make their case for things like competitive tax rates?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I so much wanted to kind of add stuff to what's been said, especially Lisa's most recent comments. I think the reality is Lisa talked about unintended consequences. We should be saying straight up, if you believe in free trade and if you believe in North American free trade, we must have tax competitiveness. Let Canadians compete on the skilled labor that we have, how smart we are, how innovative we are. But we can't disadvantage ourselves if we really believe in an integrated North American market. Like if we want to be, no offense to Albanians, but like if we want to be Albania, like sure, fill your boots, do whatever you want. But the thing is that if we want to compete globally and if we want to be part of a strong North American market, we must be tax competitive. I think one thing that's missing from this, Lisa, and if I could add, I agree with everything you said, but I'd like to add a thing. This isn't just for large enterprises.
Mhm.
This is also for small and medium-sized enterprises, 100%. And, so I think the narrative has to be, we want large enterprises to be competitive. We need mid-sized enterprises and small enterprises to be competitive, because that's the only way that we're going to create wealth and jobs. And, I think part of the problem is that this is framed in terms of, giving a break or a tax break to large corporations, when the reality is that's all we're doing is ensuring that they can compete. It won't even mean that we're successful if we're tax competitive, but it just means that we can compete. And I think we have to kind of shift the narrative to, this isn't just about large enterprises. This is for all types of enterprises that generate wealth in the country. And then to say, hey, you know what? We're not an island. We have the United States beside us. We have the United States and Mexico as trading partners. We're part of an integrated North American economy. Let's make sure that we can compete and that, the economy can grow.
Theo, can I ask, I just want to get Nik's a thought on something, because Nik did some work for us as well. Just to preface it, so there's a TikTok that's viral in social media right now. And what it is, they show a person and they say the person is a country, and then they show the person running. And as they add what the taxes are, the person actually takes on physically the burden of running with more and more money wrapped around them. So you can see the impact on the individual when you have more taxes put upon them, and the countries are listed. I tell you the story because kids, other than me, kids watch TikTok. It's something that is of interest to them. It's the way they communicate. And they're getting that message loud and clear. So to your point, Theo, what do corporations need to do? That message is getting out there in a very different way from a very different group of people, talking about why are we staying in Canada? We should go somewhere else where the tax competitiveness is better, because you can run faster and you can run longer and you can run better. But Nik, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you guys did on how young Canadians feel about Canada right now?
What am I supposed to cheer everybody up? Is that why you said
I know. Sorry about that. But it's a real concern. Like, we're talking things in a theoretical kind of way, but here's a real impact.
Yeah, the thing is that in the work that we've done, what's very clear when we ask young Canadians about how they feel about the future and their own economic prospects, they are the most pessimistic. And thanks, Lisa, for the setup. The reality is that in the past, young Canadians have been the most optimistic. They have their first job, they're saving money, they're paying down their student debts. Things are usually moving in the right direction. But now what we're finding is that young Canadians are the most pessimistic. And to Lisa's point about the TikTok, some people might make fun of that. I don't, because the reality is that individuals, why don't we just call it individual young people and enterprises and entrepreneurs, are much more mobile today than they were 10 and 20 years ago. And that there are a lot more global options. So we have to compete to create an environment in Canada where young Canadians want to stay, to build lives and families and to build enterprises, so that we have the wealth that we need to pay for that social safety net that we all want.
Can I just quickly add one other point to this? I know that there's a big focus here on corporate taxes, and certainly they're very important vis-a-vis investment. But when you get to the smaller and medium businesses, we can't forget that personal taxes also play a big role, including taxes on capital gains and dividends, etc. And in fact, that is, I think, a very significant issue now starting to face Canada. We actually rely more on personal income taxes compared to both the United States and other countries in terms of funding our government. And of course, we actually have amongst the G7 countries, we actually have a very high marginal tax rate at the top end. It's roughly around 53% on average across Canada. It is just a little bit below France. It's a little bit below Japan. But unlike Japan and France, our top rate hits at 2.7 times the average wage in Canada. While in Japan, it's 9 point something times the average wage. And in France, it's 14 times the average wage. In other words, we apply our top rate at a relatively low income. All the other G7 countries are below us, including the United States. Now, of course, there'll be a big debate in the United States coming up after the election in terms of what's going to happen to all those, the reversal of the tax cuts that were part of the 2017 Act. But the main point is that we have a serious issue on the personal tax side, and that's where young people are also looking at. The entrepreneurs want to be able to grow ahead, and as we know in Canada, we don't get many small companies growing into larger companies, which is another issue. And so I think there's a whole bunch of tax issues that need to be addressed that go beyond just the corporate tax, but also include personal tax in terms of what we're doing.
John, do you want to quickly wade into the idea of how corporations can better communicate from a global perspective? Is this a skepticism towards large corporations? Is that an issue? And how do global corporations try to gain that support, the public support?
I mean, I think the best argument that the corporate community has when thinking about a policy environment that helps them grow is talking about jobs and wealth creation. And in the U.S. context, large corporations are responsible for a very large share of job creation, over 50%, despite being a relatively small number of entities. And the reason they're able to do this is because they're able to keep their after-tax earnings, reinvest them into growth and productivity and investment and research, and in doing so become these incredible engines for productivity and wealth creation. And I think what you've seen in the U.S. is a fairly effective campaign by the corporate community to make the point that, hey, we are the U.S. This is how the U.S. projects global power. This is how the U.S. ensures that the social safety net can be funded, is by earning all the money that we do. And having a competitive tax rate has been a big part of that. And it's one of the reasons that the U.S. decided to lower its tax rate. And it's one of the reasons that you've seen a lot of countries over the last 20 years lowering their tax rates in order to attract this kind of investment. So I think for any company, leading with the story of the jobs that are created and the ultimate benefits that accrue to Canada or to the U.S. or whatever jurisdiction is a really important part of the story for why companies matter. And even in places where there's relatively low trust of large institutions, the fact that people do relate to their employers and they do want to defend their employers and stand up for the belief that their employers are doing good in society. And I think that's a credible argument that can be made in Canada as well as in the U.S.
Okay, I want to pivot here a little bit toward a discussion of some actual tax changes, some recent tax changes. We've seen everything from the surtax on banks a couple of years ago to some big changes this year, including as John and as I list a few, and we can talk about this as we go along. We have the surtax on Canadian banks and insurers that was introduced in 2022. The federal government introduced new taxes on banks and life insurers permanently, 1.5% corporate income surtax. That was on top of a one-time additional tax that they implemented in 2022. The tax almost certainly at the margins is impacting loan growth and cost of credit at the margin. We don't know how much, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. All at a time when earnings at banks have largely flatlined. Anyone have any thoughts on this particular tax, or we'll move on next to the carbon tax?
I'm happy to weigh in, being that I'm happy to have a job at CIBC. It's kind of what I was saying though before, Theo. The reality is that these higher taxes deters investment, especially ones that come up the way that these ones came up, which were surprises. These were things that were not planned for. They came out of the blue. They came as part of a budget, and you never know whether or not that's going to come back again. And it makes long-term planning really difficult. So it's a hit but you don't know whether or not the hit is going to necessarily continue in the future, or if it's going to come back. So that uncertainty, as well as the taxation itself, does lend itself to difficulties with investors wanting to come in and invest in your stock. The importance of having more money available in a bank to invest can't be underestimated or understated. I mean, if you take a look at all the financial institutions over the last 10 years, they've actually invested $115 billion, billion with a B, in innovation and tech. I mean, that is a staggering number, and that is purchased in cases here in Canada to keep smaller companies going. It also helps in terms of economic growth, because with more capital, you can lend out more to individuals, to small businesses, for mortgages, for loans, those kinds of things. And then the last part, I would say that it's not to be underestimated, the importance of those dividends coming from those investments to pension plans across the country and to individual investors, that it's part of their retirement, it's part of what they're counting on going forward. So that stability is needed there as well. So surprise surtaxes that you're not anticipating, that you have to account for, or mistakes that are made in terms of implementing an OECD tax that's going to have a huge hit in a single year. Those are things that are really problematic for our financial institutions and for our insurance companies.
Yeah, actually, I could add to that. I think a very important question that often comes up, and that's who pays the corporate income tax. There's a presumption, I think, by people that corporations pay it, but of course, corporations, it's just a paper entity. There are people that work for the corporation. There are people that own capital that are invested in the corporation, and then there's the customers who also buy goods and services from the corporation. And in fact, many economic studies, especially for open economies like Canada, small open economies like Canada, have shown that that by and large, most of the corporate tax actually is either shifted forward as higher consumer prices. So in the case, Lisa, your bank customers might be small businesses getting loans, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be whacked with higher interest rates. Or they will lead to lower wages or unemployment. In other words, labor getting hit by the corporate taxes. Instead of the corporate tax being a progressive tax, in the sense that higher income people are going to pay it as opposed to lower income people, the corporate tax is a regressive tax. It tends to fall more on the lower income and middle income people. And I think that is something that is often escaped, but is important to reiterate, because all those corporate taxes are not actually solving the income inequality issue. It's actually making the income inequality issue worse.
Okay, so why don't we stay on the corporate income tax theme and talk a little bit about the global minimum tax. It's something that I want to talk a little bit more about. It's less well known. It's technical, but has some very important implications for Canada, for all countries. But in Canada, it appears to be, Canada is moving more quickly than other main trading partners. The Europeans have moved forward, not the Americans. As John mentioned, the Americans do have their own minimum tax. It's below the 15% threshold, if I'm not mistaken. John, correct me if I'm wrong. But this is, I'm just going to explain it a little bit because it is technical. It's a global tax regime that has about 140 signatories. The aim there is to remove loopholes that allow multinationals to shift profits to low tax jurisdictions. It imposes a minimum tax of 15% on corporate income in each jurisdiction. It does not allow for kind of offsetting between low and high income jurisdictions, which I think the American one does provide for. Again, John, if you correct me if I'm wrong, governments are essentially giving themselves the right to tax the income their homegrown businesses earn in foreign jurisdictions, which may sound good in theory, but in practice, it means governments could be undermining their own global champions by imposing on them a higher tax profile than competitors, which is why many of the signatories, like the US, haven't outlined any roadmap yet. Others, like Switzerland, are moving ahead more gradually to better align their rollout with other countries. Canada, and I think this is the criticism here, is Canada has decided to move ahead with full implementation this year, kind of a less of a nuanced rollout, at least compared to its trading partners. And that's kind of created some concern and some weird distortions. Manulife, you mentioned, Lisa, insurance. Manulife has taken this massive $88 million charge for the first 6 months of this year, driving up its tax liabilities because of kind of a misaligned rollout with Hong Kong in this case. And that's a high cost for the courtesy of being based in Canada. So anyways, Jack, maybe we'll go to you on this first. You know this well. Wondering if you can unpack the GMT for us a little bit. And in particular, what do you think of the early adoption of it, that criticism?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that the goal of the corporate minimum tax is to try to put a floor on corporate income tax rate. It won't drop below 15%. And I will differ a bit from what Jon said earlier on. Yes, Ireland was at 12.5%. They're going to 15%, but that's still a very significant advantage compared to most countries, including the United States, which on average has a rate close to 25%. So Canada's actually rate is close to 26%. And so we have many of our corporations won't have to pay the corporate minimum tax. It is a highly complex agreement. And it has one attribute to it that is I find just absolutely horrible from the point of view of tax policy. And that is a country that happens to have a little bit of let's say a subsidiary operating in it, has the right to tax the income of a parent in another country. That is not what corporate taxes have been about in the past. You only tax the income that's being generated in your own country, not having the access to tax income in other parts of the world where you don't even have business activity. And I find it an absolutely dreadfully complex system. I've written, if anyone wants to read about my comments, it's in the Canadian Tax Journal paper written a couple of years ago, but it is a very complex agreement and will be very hard to change. It is also, I was just in Suriname last week, and I can tell you that the tax authorities there are absolutely in a dither about this tax, because they have no idea how they are going to be able to handle it. They don't have the tax capacity to handle all the very complex calculations that are going to have to be done in order to deal with the corporate minimum tax that has been developed by a back room of technical people sitting in a room, some, let's say, windowless room, developing a complex agreement that many countries have been signed on. And I frankly think the Americans have been smart not to have their own minimum tax. And given our relationship with the United States, I think we shouldn't have even gotten into the corporate minimum tax of the OECD, but instead follow more what the US is doing and go along with the US and try to get the same kind of agreement, which means that we should have stalled in moving ahead and try to see how things are going to evolve over the time, rather than being first mover that is now putting some companies, as we've seen with the insurance companies, in a risky situation where Canada moves ahead while other countries are still implementing what is an extremely complex agreement. By the way, it won't stop tax competition. What's happening now is all the countries are now moving to refundable tax credits that won't impact the corporate minimum tax, and they will use other policies in order to attract capital. So all it does is just put a floor on the corporate minimum tax rate, but it doesn't do anything to the base. And so it really is just, in my view, a tragedy in tax policy that we're going to be facing over the next number of years, an agreement that's going to be very difficult to change. Otherwise, I like it.
Jon, any thoughts there?
And no, I think that's really well put. I think this is a big challenge for companies to comply with, not only the new set of rules, but the fact that there's so much changes in the rules and there's inconsistency from one jurisdiction to the other. So I think that's something that you're seeing a lot of companies not understand, is how this is going to affect them. Everybody's kind of got to do a calculation of their existing tax regimes and to figure out, what's the optimal strategy. And that's just a pure deadweight loss for society to be spending all this time thinking about how to comply with shifting regimes and the different regimes there are across the globe. So I think that's a big problem for American businesses, and it's a big problem for Canadian businesses.
Okay. We'll continue going down the list of new taxes. So the higher capital gains tax came in, I think, June 25th, if I'm not mistaken. It didn't really get much political traction. I'm curious, Nik, what does your polling tell you on that? I mean, we saw in 2015 the tax the rich kind of rhetoric worked. It seemed to me this time around we didn't see the capital gains tax get much traction politically, even though it actually has heightened quite a bit concern in the business community that the government really is chasing revenue.
Well, I think the challenge is the broader narrative, right? It's not like just one specific thing. So, when there are changes in the tax regime and they all move in a particular direction, Canadians are not tax experts, but there's kind of like, it doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing. The taxes are going to be higher in Canada, and it seems that this particular government sees tax policy, and it should see tax policy as a key lever, but that it kind of all rolls itself up. The other thing is that the changes of the capital gains tax probably impact more than Jack will correct me, 0.013% of Canadians, probably a little more than that, right? In terms of entrepreneurs. No,
sorry, Nik. No.
What is
the problem with the analysis that the Department of Finance put out is that they just looked at 1 year at a time and said, there's only 0.13% taxpayers that are going to be affected. But if you look at the lifetime incidence of the change, it is much bigger than that. 100%. And I published a piece in Hub if you want to look at the numbers, but for example, in 2011, there were about 40,000 people that would be affected by the tax, roughly. But in terms of the two, leaving aside the corporate capital gains tax, which is a whole different matter, the personal one, in terms of people with more than $250,000 in capital gains, it's about 40,000 people. However, over the next 10 years, 2/3 of those people never had capital gains more than $250,000. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that people who, let's say, own a cottage, will only sell it once in their lifetime. And the same thing will be true of people selling small business shares or let's say real estate or things like that, where part of it's really part of their retirement income. So I did a calculation and I found that actually over 1 million people are going to be affected, and many of them are going to be middle-class individuals.
Yep.
And so I think one of the reasons is that the government lost its narrative, just as it did in 2017 when they changed the private corporate rules. They first came out and said, we're going to hit the rich, but then it was found out that there were a lot of middle-class people that are going to be hit. And I think the same story has now happened, where now many people understand this is not just a tax increase on the very rich, it's also a tax increase of many middle-income people.
Yeah, so thank you, Jack, for clarifying what I was trying to say in a much more eloquent and peer-reviewed fashion. But, I think the reality is that it's this broader narrative of taxes going up. And, the thing is that for the approach for this particular government, it's like who will be next, or what organization will be next, or what will be the new tax that will be getting ahead. And, the thing is that the reality for average Canadians, that's all they think about is like, what does this mean to me? Or what could this mean to me? Right. And this is where, things like the capital gains tax, and I'll put the carbon tax in there also as things that are just a bit of a pylon in terms of how Canadians who are trying to just basically struggle to pay for housing and to pay for the groceries are, feeling that there's no end in sight in terms of what might happen in terms of taxes. The other thing that I'd like to add is that, when we talk about the U.S., if the U.S. ever embarked or decided it wanted to be a high tax jurisdiction, that would provide political license for Canada to be a high tax jurisdiction because of the importance in the economy. But when we look at other economies other than the United States, those comparators, I don't think for average Canadians, they see them as relevant. And I don't think they are relevant just from a practical perspective in terms of how integrated and important the economy between the economic relationship between Canada and the United States is.
I want to move quickly.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying I agree with Nik on what he said.
Going down the list of taxes, I want to move quickly to the digital services tax. On June 20, Bill C-59 received royal assent enacting Canada's Digital Services Tax Act. The DST taxes 3% of revenue earned by large businesses from digital. The Americans are not happy about this, and there's talk of potential retaliation. Jon, how serious of an issue is this for the Americans?
Very serious. And you hear concerns not just from Republicans in Congress, but from Democrats who see this as a kind of cash grab that affects U.S. companies that are operating in Canada. And, the U.S. under the Trump administration retaliated against a number of countries other than Canada that had implemented DSTs. It seemed like these would be on hold for a little while, and some countries have put a pause on their plans because of what's happening on the OECD agreement that we talked about earlier. Canada's gone ahead with their DST. The Biden administration seems to be kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. But I think if Trump wins next year, this is very likely to result in either a USMCA dispute settlement panel or direct retaliation using the U.S.'s Section 301 authorities. So I think that's a real risk for Canadian businesses. And this story is going to play out over several years now, but it's far from over. And it's something that could result in a significant increase in tensions, particularly as the U.S. and Canada move into a period where they'll be renegotiating the U.S. MCA starting in 2026. So to me, this is a kind of an own goal by the Canadian tax authorities, and it's likely to result in some retaliation.
Theo, can I just quickly add what Jon said is absolutely spot on. But there's also another aspect that's coming into this, and that is the CRTC is going to be looking at implementing a 5% tax on the sales of streaming companies, to selling, again, digital services in that area to Canadians. And of course, that's another tax on top of the DST. And so when you start adding it up, plus they're going to be shifted forward into higher Netflix prices and everything else. And of course, that means more HST revenue that's going to be raised, or GST revenue that's going to be raised on top of that. And so, I think we really need to, get back to some first principles here about what we're doing. Because this CRTC charge, of course, at 5% is to fund Canadian content, but from streaming companies. But I think this is another example of another charge that's going to be coming in.
We're running out of time, but I really want to get to quickly the carbon tax and its implications for competitiveness in Canada, corporate competitiveness. Of course, we have these massive green tax incentives that provide an offset. But Lisa, can you just give us a sense of how you think climate policy, Canadian climate policy plays into the corporate competitiveness picture?
Way is the one you
I think you're on mute, Lisa.
I think I'm off now. The first way is the regulatory way, and the second way is the taxation way. From a regulatory point of view, a way in order to ease competitiveness, quite frankly, is to make it easier for projects to be studied quickly, efficiently, in depth, but then approved at the end of the day or disproved at the end of the day, whichever case or whatever decision is going to come out of it. But a regulatory system which seeks to grind down the proponents in order to have them go away, that just doesn't work. And that's not going to be beneficial to competitiveness here either. It's an important lever. On the tax side, right now, the debate in Canada has a lot to do with whether or not there should be a carbon tax applied to individual income tax payers, whether or not there should be on that fuel that they are putting into their house or into their cars or that they're utilizing, or even the costs that are passed onto them when they buy their groceries or they buy their clothing. The reality is that I think this has a lot of similarities with the global minimum tax, in that it's a government that wanted to be seen as being the first responder, the first person, the first country to implement this carbon tax in order to show the way and have the other countries follow behind. But if you stand and turn around and look, there's not a lot of other countries who are standing behind Canada when it comes to implementing this carbon tax on retail side. So I think that is a significant impediment for competition. I think it impedes small businesses, it impedes medium-sized businesses from growing and from doing what they want to do. And I think that's why what you're seeing right now in the political sphere is this discussion about whether or not there should be a retail carbon tax. On the other side, if we talk about an industrial carbon tax, the provinces are the ones that are putting those in place. They're the ones best placed to figure out if that's something that they want to do to encourage or discourage whatever policy it is. But for me, there's been a lot of time that we've been charging the carbon tax, yet we haven't seen what the benefits were that were promised at the end of the day, and no other countries seem to have picked up on it. The United States certainly hasn't.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our discussion. I mean, I could have asked questions for another hour, but I'll spare our audience another hour of tax policy discussions. I want to thank our panelists, Jack, Lisa, Jon, Nik, for a wonderful and insightful conversation. We've covered a significant amount of time. It's pretty clear that the issue of corporate tax competitiveness is not something that can be discussed in isolation. We need to have an understanding of how our tax system interacts with the broader economic environment and international dynamics. It matters what other countries are doing. I also want to thank all of our audience, all of you, for tuning in today, whether on social media or through our webinar registration. We'll have more conversations like this in the coming months that will keep you all updated with. So thank you and have a great rest of the day.